Welcome everyone. Bom dia a todos. Dr. Mark Pimentel, Pimentel teams in the Medically Associated Science and Technology MAST program in Cedars-Sinai Hospital that focuses on developing medications, diagnostic tests, and medical devices in order to find treatments for microbiome-related conditions. The main areas of interest and ongoing work with the MAST program include gastrointestinal motility disorders, SIBO, IBS, metabolic diseases such as obesity and diabetes, and many others as they are connected to the microbiome. We are very excited to explore these topics with you: SIBO, ME/CFS, mast cell activation syndrome, and long COVID. Dr. Pimentel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to help out if I can.
Thank you. So to start off, could you share us a bit about your work in the MAST research program and what your team has been focusing on lately?
Yeah, I've been at Cedars-Sinai for 30 years, a little bit over 30 years. And initially, when we first started looking at the microbiome, it was in irritable bowel syndrome. But funny thing about irritable bowel syndrome is it used to be thought of as a psychological condition because a lot of times when doctors don't understand something, they say, well, it's psychological. And we were studying the microbiome before the word microbiome came into being, thinking that the microbiome or bacteria in the gut were causing IBS. We helped develop rifaximin for the treatment of irritable bowel syndrome, which took about 15 years and then was finally FDA approved in 2015. We've since taken a lot of interest in the microbiome and particularly the small intestinal microbiome. Because if you look at the microbiome in general, stool microbiome, there have been over 200,000 publications of stool microbiome, but there hasn't been a single bug, single disease association yet. So there was all this promise about the microbiome, finding cures for this, finding cures for that. We decided, because of our interest in the small bowel, to be the first to really chart the small bowel microbiome. And this is where we're finding real bacteria related to disease. So we've actually come a long way with regards to IBS, which we'll get into, I believe, in terms of the subcategories of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth and how they relate to different types of IBS, whether it be diarrhea type or constipation type. And that allowed us to develop a new breath test with all three gases, to develop a first blood test for irritable bowel syndrome to say you have IBS, it's not in your head, and so many other things, which we may get into as we continue our discussion. But the MAST program was really the purpose of this was to consolidate all these ideas into a program where we could develop technologies to bring to patients, because drug companies were focused on more laxatives, more anti-diarrheas, more laxatives, more anti-diarrheals, because they were easy to make. We wanted to treat the cause. The cause is more important. If you treat the cause, the patient's better and the bowel movements are normal. And so that was our focus, and we've been very pleased with our success so far.
Yes, thank you. And to set the stage for this interview, or maybe for people who are not so familiar, why is the gut microbiome so important? How does it influence on our overall health?
So you could say, and this is sort of some of the theoretical considerations, that humans, the human body and the healthy human body is not human. It's part microbe, part human, and we all work together for the common benefit. An example is humans need folic acid, which is a vitamin, but humans don't produce folic acid. So the bacteria of the gut produce folic acid, give it to you, allowing you to be healthy. Without that folic acid, you would be very sick. You couldn't survive. So we have a common relationship with the microbes in our gut. But these microbes can alter and be abnormal in certain individuals, leading to poor health. One example is H. pylori. It's part of the microbe population in the gut, but when it's too high, you can get ulcers. Everybody knows this now. There's another bacteria called C. difficile, which is if you check people's stool, many people have tiny amounts of it in their stool, but when it's too much, you can get very sick and even die from that infection. So we live in harmony with the microbiome, but when there's an imbalance, then things can be, or it can lead to disease and suffering. So.
So before we get into specifics, it's important to acknowledge why SIBO has become such a central topic in discussions about chronic multi-system illnesses. In simple terms, what is SIBO and how is it diagnosed today?
Well, SIBO is the original terminology for too many bacteria in the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So let's use those words. It's small intestine, and that it's bacteria being too high, so meaning the overgrowth. But SIBO is now broken into three different types of microbial overgrowths. There's the SIBO, there's the intestinal sulfide overproduction, and IMO, which is intestinal methanogen overgrowth, because methanogens don't just live in the small bowel, they live in the colon too, so you can't use the word small intestine. So now we've divided this into three subtexts. But SIBO is extremely common, as IBS is common, because we believe 60% of irritable bowel syndrome is in fact SIBO or one of these types of SIBO. And so it's extremely common, and patients suffer from bloating, distension, changes in bowel function, often young people who are just trying to go to work, get an education, raise a family, and they're suffering and struggling with these chronic illnesses. And while some people used to originally think IBS, for example, is a lifestyle illness because it's not going to kill you, so don't worry, the suffering from it is worse than diabetes, heart disease, and other illnesses because it is so profoundly symptomatic for patients that when doctors tell them don't worry about it, they're frustrated. And so when you have a population or IBS, for example, which affects 1 billion people in the world, and the doctors are telling 1 billion people don't worry about it, but it's bothering them a lot, this is a big problem. And so SIBO solves part of that issue because it's a cause of this and can be treated.
What typically causes SIBO to develop in the first place? What are the main causes?
Yeah, this was one of the most important things that we've discovered, but let me just say that as a fundamental problem, SIBO develops anytime there is a poor clearance of the small intestine. Think of the small intestine as a fast-flowing river, because in about 2 hours, you do your digestion and everything then goes to the colon. And there are special cleaning waves of the gut that then clean the gut and get ready for the next meal. So like a dishwasher, washing the small intestine. But when that river, that 15-foot long small intestine, is too slow, and it can be slow for a lot of reasons. It could be slow because you have a blockage. You can get SIBO. If you have Crohn's disease and strictures, you can get SIBO. If you're on narcotics, which slow the gut down, you can get SIBO. But IBS is the most common cause because it's the largest condition. And this is where we spent a lot of time focusing on the SIBO of IBS because we couldn't understand why. But we now do. We understand that food poisoning. So if you go to a restaurant and you got very sick from that restaurant, or you ate something when you were traveling and you got very sick with diarrhea and vomiting, often the IBS starts then. And we now know that if you get food poisoning, you get antibodies to the nerves of your gut from these toxins from food poisoning called antivinculin antibodies. And these antibodies damage the nerves of the gut slows down, and then you get SIBO. So we now know the origins of SIBO, and therefore it's an opportunity to perhaps treat those antibodies and cure SIBO forever. But we're not there yet. But we know what to do. We're just getting there now.
Do we have any reliable tools to measure gut motility in clinical practice?
Well, we can measure these antibodies. These antibodies are commercially available in the US, the anti-CDTB and anti-vinculin antibodies through a test called IBS Smart. The blood test is being used all over the US and parts of Europe. I believe Unilab in Switzerland is doing some distribution across Europe for the test. But measuring the actual motility is a little bit challenging. You have to have a specialized center. They put a tube in the nose, we do this all the time, into the small intestine, leave it for 6 hours and measure the pressure waves of the intestine. And you can see the lack of the cleaning waves. And then you know that the person has SIBO on the basis of less cleaning waves of the gut. But that's a little bit invasive. And the majority of patients with IBS who have SIBO, that's the reason. So we don't need to do that test too often, especially since we have the blood test, the antibody test.
Yeah, and something that has been getting more attention is biofilms. Can you explain what are they and why are they matter in conditions like SIBO or IBS?
Yeah, so if you think about your teeth, people get their teeth cleaned because they get this film that's very hard and scaly that builds up on the teeth. That's a biofilm. That is not the same as the biofilm of the small intestine or the colon. Biofilms are different depending upon which bacteria are creating them. In the teeth, they become very, very hard biofilms. But in the gut, they tend to be like thick mucus biofilms. Some biofilms protect you because they prevent things from getting into your body. Other biofilms are harboring the bad characters. So in the case of IBS, in the context of what we're discussing today, we have discovered that rifaximin works very, very well for IBS. However, patients relapse quite soon after treatment, 3 months, 6 months, a year. And what we realized is that the SIBO of IBS, the E. coli and the Klebsiella, live in the mucus layer or the biofilm. Half of them live there, half of them live in the free fluid layer. So rifaximin will get rid of the free fluid E. coli and Klebsiella, but the biofilm layer, it can't penetrate. And so we've developed a new product that adds an N-acetylcysteine, which breaks the mucus, with rifaximin in a particular way of delivering it so that you break the biofilm and then you kill the SIBO more reliably. And already we have studies that we presented at the DDW this spring showing that this works so much better than rifaximin alone. So the biofilm is important because maybe we need to break the biofilm in order to get the SIBO more completely.
Yes, very interesting. And many patients living with CFS, ME, they report gastrointestinal symptoms such as bloating, nausea, abdominal pain, diarrhea, constipation, so forth. And as awareness grows around the gut-brain immune connection, one area drawing increasing attention is precisely the relationship between SIBO and ME/CFS. So, in what ways might SIBO contribute to symptoms such as chronic fatigue or brain fog? And what are the possible mechanisms behind that connection?
Well, the way I try to explain it to people is that I don't know how familiar your audience would be with hepatic encephalopathy. So hepatic encephalopathy is the liver, when things enter your blood from the gut, they go into the portal vein first. That's the vein that goes straight to the liver. The liver processes the food that's been broken down and decides what should be stored, what should be distributed to the rest of the body, and where the food should go. But the liver also has another function, which is it's a filter. It's a filter to detoxify any bacteria that happen to get in or toxins from the bacteria that happen to get in. They go to the liver first. The liver says, okay, this is bad. We have to get rid of this. We can't let this go to the blood or to the brain or to other parts of the body. We have to decontaminate. But when you have cirrhosis of the liver, when your liver is damaged, then your ability to filter the bacterial proteins and components coming from the gut is disabled. And people in that situation get confused, real confusion, like to the point where they could be in the hospital not knowing who they are, what they're doing. And so that's encephalopathy. So that's when the liver is failing. So the liver is failing, it can't filter the bacterial products. But if the liver is overwhelmed by too many bacterial products, they can spill over because the liver can't handle all of it. So in the case of SIBO, we do see patients. So it's multifactorial, but one of the factors we believe is that there's so much bacteria in the small bowel that it is overwhelming the liver, allowing some of those products to spill over, leading to some mild encephalopathy, if you want to call it that. Another thing that we know from the microbial overgrowths is that there can be changes in blood sugar that are abnormal. Like patients with SIBO can have, for example, low blood sugar after eating. We've seen that, we've published on that, and that can also give you sort of a brain fog because you basically have hypoglycemia. And the third is that if you have methanogen overgrowth, intestinal methanogen overgrowth, so methane is a hydrocarbon similar to chloroform, similar to isoflurane. And chloroform is the original anesthesia gas to make people fall asleep. But methane is a less potent chloroform. So the more methane you have in your body, the more drowsy or more fatigued you are. So methane can also create a sense of fatigue or vagueness so that your concentration is affected. So there's multiple reasons. I'm sorry for the long answer, but there's a lot of reasons why these things can happen.
Yes, and how often do you see patients with a positive breath test that experience or might not experience the classic symptoms, typical symptoms of SIBO, and presently mainly with fatigue, brain fog, or post-exertional malaise?
Yeah, so I mean, the problem with fatigue and malaise is that almost every disease in the textbook can cause fatigue and malaise. And so when I have a patient in my office with these symptoms, you have to be very careful not to attribute every patient with fatigue and malaise to SIBO. You have to look for thyroid disease. You have to look for metabolic dysfunction, kidney problems, liver problems. I mean, there's a lot to look for. But assuming it is SIBO in that person, it's very easy to test. You do the breath test and then you treat, and if the symptoms go away, that was what it was. It's straightforward. But you just have to be careful you're not missing something. But I just want to say one more thing because when I'm teaching the fellows in the clinic, they say, "Oh, the patient." I asked the patient if their bowel movements were normal, and the patient said, "Yeah, they're normal." And I said, "Well, did you ask them about the bowel movements?" And he said, "No, no, they said it was normal." I said, "But are they normal?" And so when you then, some patients say, "I have a normal bowel movement," and then you go in the room and you say, "Well, what does it look like?" "Well, it looks like mashed potatoes." Every day? Yes, every day. But it's always been that way, so don't worry. I think it's normal for me. It's not normal. So, and then we treat them, and then all of a sudden they have logs that look like normal bowel movements, and they say, "Oh, this is normal." So when a patient says, "I have normal bowel movements," I don't believe it until I exactly ask the right questions. Because if you've had it for 20 years, you think that's normal. You don't know any different. And so some of these patients with fatigue, when we start to dissect their symptoms, their bowel habits are not normal at all. They just didn't assume that that wasn't what everybody had.
Yes, very interesting. And if someone with an existing diagnosis with ME or chronic fatigue syndrome diagnoses a breath test, a positive breath test for SIBO,
Yeah.
does that change somehow your treatment approach compared to a typical SIBO patient?
Well, let me take it even one step further. So in some early studies that we did, we were connecting SIBO in some sense to chronic fatigue syndrome, but also to fibromyalgia. And we were seeing that the level of hydrogen on breath test in patients with chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia being even higher, the hydrogen was much higher. And when we see these very high hydrogens, they are a little bit more difficult to get down to normal with treatment. So you have to be a little bit more aggressive with some of your treatments with some of these chronic fatigue fibromyalgia patients because sometimes the hydrogen can be very high and again, more challenging to respond. But in general, the approach is the same for the first step. So if you have hydrogen, we give rifaximin. That's our primary treatment, and I think in Europe is the same way. If you have methane, we give rifaximin plus neomycin or rifaximin plus metronidazole. If you have hydrogen sulfide, we give rifaximin with Pepto-Bismol. And hydrogen sulfide is interesting because hydrogen sulfide is extremely toxic. And so some of the patients who are frustrated or who do a breath test and they feel like it's negative or they're not responding, they may have hydrogen sulfide. And that 3-gas breath test is only just being available in the US, not available in Europe yet. So it's something we're hoping that will come to Europe in the next year or two to be available because that makes all the difference in terms, especially fatigue.
Yes, and more broadly, do you see harmful biofilms, as we were talking about earlier, as a playing role in chronic illness like ME/CFS? Could targeting biofilms, as you talked with N-acetylcysteine,
Yeah.
potentially shift the trajectory of these conditions?
Well, we're just about to start a phase 2b double-blind randomized controlled trial in 3 centers in the US starting January 1st. It's not specifically for chronic fatigue, but that drug, that cocktail of the NAC with the rifaximin with a specific delivery system could very well be a better answer for people with chronic fatigue who have these biofilms. So we will know in maybe a year what kind of success we're having and then be able to translate that into other conditions like chronic fatigue syndrome.
That's great. And well, in recent years, mast cell activation syndrome, MCAS, has been a major focus in discussions around chronic gut disorders and chronic
Yes.
illness such as ME/CFS. Do you, how do mast cells affect gut function and systemic inflammation?
So the axis of the microbiome, the mast cell activation, histamine, which is part of the process of mast cell degranulation, they're all interconnected. So our lab has been spending a lot of time looking at biogenic amines. So histamine is one of the biogenic amines, putrescine, cadaverine, all these different chemicals. And many of them trigger eosinophils or mast cell activation or mast cell recruitment to the gut. And so one of the bacteria that we're very interested in is Klebsiella, because Klebsiella is part of SIBO, but SIBO is mostly E. coli, but some people have more Klebsiella. And Klebsiella is a histamine producer, so it will produce histamine more than any other bacteria in the gut that we know of, and as a result could activate mast cells or could promote mast cells in the gut. So we don't have all the answers yet, but we are seeing this histamine, heightened histamine in patients with Klebsiella, and how that could be a very important piece of information as we move forward to try to understand how to treat these mast cell disorders.
In your practice, how often do you see patients with IBS or chronic digestive issues who also have signs of MCAS?
A lot, a
Yeah.
lot, especially these days, because in our clinics, the majority of patients who benefit from one treatment of rifaximin and they're seeing their gastroenterologist in the community. So we're seeing the tougher cases in our clinic. And so we see a lot of mast cell disorders. We see a lot of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and those sorts of conditions. So yes, we see mast cell disorders almost every week.
Yeah. And now I wanted to do a question about long COVID. So, what do we currently know about the mechanisms behind connecting a post-viral infection like COVID-19, long COVID, to a subsequent gut dysbiosis or bacterial overgrowth?
Yeah. So this is there's a number of papers that have come out. There was a very nice paper from one of my colleagues in Mexico where they were looking at the development of IBS or a higher level of IBS development after having COVID or long COVID. I have seen thousands and thousands of IBS patients over 25 years. And I can't, I cannot tell you even one patient who was worse because they had COVID. Um, I do see patients who had COVID who now have unusual nerve problems like neuropathies or folate deficiencies, which we talked about folate in the beginning. And so there is some changes to the microbiome from COVID. We did one paper on the small bowel microbiome in patients who had COVID versus those who did not have COVID. And then we looked at before COVID microbiomes and after COVID microbiomes. And there are some substantial changes since COVID, but we can't actually say that it's causing SIBO, and we cannot say that it's causing IBS definitively, although there's some evidence, as I say, from Mexico and a couple of other studies. So it's a little bit confusing, but we do believe COVID can cause neuropathy. So if it can cause neuropathy of the hands and feet, it can cause neuropathy of the gut. So potentially it can cause IBS or SIBO. But I haven't seen that dramatic rise in SIBO in the last 2, 3 years since COVID.
Okay. Now, switching gears to treatment and management. When it comes to SIBO and chronic gut issues, one of the biggest challenges patients face often is simply not knowing where to start. So, if someone is experiencing bloating after eating, abdominal pain, diarrhea, constipation, and might suspect a SIBO case, what's your recommended first step? Should they see a gastrointestinal doctor first, do a breath test?
Yeah. So I'm very well aware of what we do here and the challenges in different parts of Europe and especially Portugal. But in the US, we have the availability of breath tests, including the availability of breath tests to be done at home. So the home breath test is the one that does 3 gases. So that's the best one on the market now. And the majority of breath tests in the US are now using that test. And so it's easy for the doctor to order the test. It comes to the patient's house, they get the result, and then they treat the gas result. The challenge is in parts of the world where the breath test is not easily available, such as Portugal. And so in that situation, sometimes the doctors say, well, look, we don't need the breath test. We're going to give rifaximin anyways, so let's just give rifaximin. And to be honest, that's okay. If you don't have the breath test, that is the right way to treat the patient. The problem is that if you have hydrogen sulfide or if you have methane or if you have hydrogen, the treatments are different. And so if the patient doesn't respond, then you're kind of stuck and you don't know if they have one of the other gases, and you might be missing the opportunity to make that patient better without knowing the gases. So that's where it becomes a challenge. Now, there are places in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, in Spain, they have, I believe, a place called Calderon. They do breath testing, but you have to be there. You have to do the breath test there. And so there are places nearby Portugal where breath testing can be done if a patient really needs to get it done or wants to get it done. Do you have breath testing that you know of anywhere in Portugal, Lisbon, major medical centers?
Yes, mainly we see it in private clinical labs. We have some options already for tests
Okay,
that you
great.
actually do there in the
Yes, the Grupo
presential.
Germano de Souza, the Grupo Germano de Souza, which is one of the largest laboratory networks, they now provide the SIBO, teste respiratório de metano.
Oh, great. That's
Methane.
great.
That's new.
That's
It's
great.
new. And Dr. Germano Souza is part of our scientific advisory committee. This is an area that we're working towards, is to develop a series of diagnostic tools and recommended tests for a variety of illnesses that are related to ME and long COVID. But yes, that is a new test, and it is available, and it's a big step.
I would love to meet that lab because
Yes.
it would be interesting to meet the director or the person you mentioned. But,
Yeah, no, absolutely. We're going to forward this talk show to him.
okay, great.
So could you walk us through, you already talked a little bit about the treatments that you usually do to patients, but do you, how do you decide what's the best approach for each individual? Is there a specific diet that one should follow?
I think the most important first step that we advocate for is that breath test and making sure you know which gas you have, because then you direct the treatment correctly. So assume the patient has hydrogen and they get rifaximin and then they feel great, 80% better after treatment. So we then usually recommend to the patient a low fermentation diet, not low FODMAP. I don't use low FODMAP. It's too restrictive. It's impossible to go to restaurants to live a normal life with a low FODMAP diet. So the low fermentation diet is a diet that it's free. You just download it from the internet, and it basically restricts the foods that would feed the bacteria. That way they don't come back so quickly. So I see patients at the mall, in the grocery store. 2 years later, they say, oh, I'm still better. I feel great. I haven't seen you in clinic because I feel great. That's great. That's about 20 or 30% of the patients. But then about 60% of the patients, they will relapse. And they will relapse anywhere from 1 month to 1 year. And so you have to decide at that point, first of all, we would treat again, but you have to decide, do you need to be more aggressive? And remember, we talked at the beginning of this conversation about motility being a problem or the gut movements being a problem. So in patients who relapse every 2 or 3 or 4 months, then we treat again with rifaximin, and then we again use the diet, but we give them a prokinetic at night. And the prokinetic at night is making the cleaning waves, whatever cleaning waves they can produce, get some to happen at night with the prokinetic. And then what we see is that they can last, instead of 2 months, they can last almost a year without relapse using that technique. Now, that's what we do now. In the future, we hope we can get rid of the antibody from the blood and cure this once and for all, and then we're done. But that's 5 or 6 years from now.
Yes, that would be precisely the next question, because the motility issues is often the primary cause. And there also has been interest in vagus nerve stimulation as a
Right.
way to influence gut function. Has your research team explored any devices or strategies related to vagal stimulations? And do you see it as a potential viable therapeutic approach?
I'm going to be controversial, but I find it a little bit entertaining to hear about vagus nerve these days, because for 30, 40 years, the more traditional researchers in IBS historically have said the treatment for IBS is tricyclic antidepressants, because tricyclics are anticholinergic. If you're anticholinergic, what does that do? That turns the vagus off, because the vagus is a cholinergic nerve. So if you take a tricyclic, you're turning the vagus nerve off. And they were saying, this is how you treat IBS. This is how you treat IBS. This is how you treat IBS for 30 years. And now they're all excited for vagal nerve stimulation. Vagal nerve stimulation turns the vagus on. So which one is it? Is it turning it off or turning it on, or you have no idea? And so I think it's more you have no idea and you're trying things. And turning the vagus nerve on is more sense than turning it off. So I would say, if you're going to do something, vagal nerve stimulation might be worth a try. But there's only a couple of studies in IBS where it shows benefit. So I would like to see a little bit more data. And of course, each study uses a different stimulator, one for the short branch on the ear, one on the neck. The vagus nerves go along the neck, and there's a small branch of the vagus nerve on the ear. So we have to figure out which one works best. Does it work? And more studies are needed. So I'm not objecting to vagus nerve stimulation. I just find it funny that for 30 years they tell us to turn the vagus nerve off, and now they're telling us turn it on, which means they were either wrong before or they're wrong now, and we don't know which of the two. Do you understand what I'm saying? So
Yes,
it's a little
yes.
bit of confusion for the patient. So imagine the patient is saying, "You used to tell me to turn it off, now you're telling me to turn it on. Do you know what you're talking about?" And that's what I find interesting.
Yes, indeed, very interesting. Um, we would like to ask you what opportunities, resources exist for going professional education for clinicians, researchers in Portugal and in Brazil who are interested in deepening their knowledge on SIBO.
Yeah, we are very fortunate in that we have two of the smartest PhDs that I know, Gabriela Leite and Juliana Germano, both from Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they are absolute geniuses. Of course, Portuguese, obviously, from their Brazilian heritage. But we have people who just recently are emailing me wanting to come to the lab for 1 year to learn our techniques. We have another one who wants to come to be in the clinic for a month to learn how to manage SIBO. So we offer these types of internships here at Cedars-Sinai. So if anybody's interested, that's one possibility. There's also a number of people around the country here in the US that are very big experts in SIBO, and I'm happy to provide a list of places where they teach this.
Yeah, that would be great. And well, this conversation has been great. It's a real privilege to speak with you. And before we close, for our patients, people with ME/CFS and who are dealing with gastrointestinal issues like SIBO, would you share some words of hope and encouragement? What possibilities do they see for better understanding and ultimately improving their condition in the future, really?
Yeah, and I think there's every reason to be optimistic now. I mean, 10 years ago, we were still a bit in the dark. We were fumbling around. But it's not just our program, but there are multiple programs around the US very focused on trying to understand the microbiome. But as we really realize, the small intestinal microbiome is extremely important because that's where everything gets absorbed. And we're finding biomarkers in the blood. We're finding connections between how the microbiome that you have causes you to react in a bad way that can cause fatigue, that can cause all these GI symptoms. We are understanding it in the most deep way possible that we never imagined we could do before. For example, this year for DDW, we planned 26 abstracts. That's the highest number ever. And we're doing proteomics, which is what the bacteria produce in the gut. The proteomics of the human, what the human's doing in response to the bacteria in the gut, how the gut is reacting, the blood in the patients, what blood tests are changing because of the changes in the microbiome, and how is that affecting your mood? How is that affecting, your fatigue levels? So the acceleration of understanding is so fast right now and the treatments are starting to come out. We've got 3 new treatments that are emerging that we think that there's going to be a great impact on patients' health very shortly. I think we weren't not optimistic. We just didn't have good targets yet. But now we have really good targets that we think could develop into therapies that will have an immense benefit in the near future for patients. So you should be very optimistic that things are coming, even if they're not here now.
Well, thank you. Your clarity and knowledge have made this conversation incredibly helpful, and we are truly grateful that you share this today. And of course, for your work and your team, thank you for your contributions. Your research has already helped so many patients and continues to bring new possibilities for better diagnosis, better outcomes, and hope, really. And thank you for this time, your generosity, and your dedication to moving this field forward. And it's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. It's great to speak with you both as well.